Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah Doss. I work at both Sugar Pine Point State Park and Donner Memorial State Park. And today we are going to learn about the wildfire history of the Lake Tahoe area, as well as the native peoples who lived here and continue to live here and were here way before we were. So I want to share my screen and show you some pretty cool things on a map. All right. So this is obviously the state of California, but these are not counties. These are Native American tribes. So here is Lake Tahoe, and I am right here on Washoe land. So take a second to look where you are located on this map, and if you're in California anyway, and what tribes are native to the area in which you are living. Awesome, lots of tribes. And of course, these borders weren't hard borders. There was lots of movement of the tribes across the state. Now I want to look at where we are in the world. So of course, we're going to zoom in here to California. And this is Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe is like a big freezing freshwater bathtub nestled in the tops of the mountains here in the Sierra Nevada. And it is super crystal clear. It's very beautiful. If you ever see a blue lake on your screensaver that's crystal clear, it's most likely going to be Lake Tahoe. So Lake Tahoe was formed millions of years ago by some river, and there was a volcano nearby. The volcano erupted and the lava flowed down, blocked the river, and started to fill up the basin in between the mountains. So that started to make Lake Tahoe. Now, also, the snow and the rain over those millions of years filled up Lake Tahoe, as well as glaciers moving into the area, cutting the mountains and melting in the lake as well. Awesome. So let's see. So today we're going to talk about how the Tahoe Basin, this area, and this applies really to the rest of the world as well, but how our climate has changed both culturally and environmentally. So we've gone through lots of changes. So first we're going to focus on the original stewards of the land, the Washoe. So they were here in the spring and summer. They would hunt, fish. The lakes and the animals up here were very plentiful. However, they knew to get off the mountain before the snows came, because we get a lot of snow. As you can see behind me, this is not a lot of snow for us. We did get 16 feet of snow in just the month of December alone. We get normally about 34 feet a year on average. So when the Washoe would migrate off the mountain, they would burn down their houses first. Any idea? You can type it in the chat or think about it at home. Why would they want to do that? Why would they burn down their houses and then immediately leave? So they weren't hanging around the fire for warmth. Any ideas? All right. I'm gonna let you think about it, but the reason why is because they knew that the fire would spread from their houses out into the woods and basically burn up the little bit of pine cones, pine needles, dead trees on the ground, and then return those nutrients to the soil. So the nutrients in the soil would regrow plants that would make these. So this is a basket. And so the Native Americans would use those new plants that would regrow to build and weave these baskets, which is pretty neat. They knew that. And they also knew that a lot more edible plants, medicinal plants would regrow. That way, when they returned the following year, they would have more diverse plants to use. And So they really not only used fire for warmth and for rituals, but also for forest management. Now, we all know that the Native Americans got taken off their land and put on reservations. Now, when that happened, obviously, they stopped managing the forest with fire. Now, the people who took over the land management, the pioneers, the new Americans, they didn't understand why you'd ever want to burn the forest. And so they just threw kind of that idea out the window. They probably didn't understand it at all. And they did not manage the forest with fire. Now, take a second to think. Why do we love trees? Is it because maybe they provide us oxygen, they provide us shelter, materials to build our homes? They also provide animal shelter, shade for plants, animals, humans. They provide us with ground stabilization. Their roots hold the ground together. Their branches slow down the wind speed. So we love trees for a lot of reasons. Now, the new pioneers, the new Americans, did not love trees for all those reasons. They loved the trees because the trees could be cut down and sold for lumber. So I'm going to share my screen and show you what it started to look like up here. So they logged 80% of the trees in the Lake Tahoe area. That's a ton of trees, right? Started to look really different up here. That doesn't look like a place you'd want to live, much less any animals, right? Look, it's very stripped. Now, we started to have a lot of things change environmentally because of all this. The original inhabitants were taken off their land. Those burning practices were not done anymore. The land was stripped of a lot of its trees. Of course, the animals didn't like that, so they moved out. Then we've got this change, this other change called climate change, where we're getting warmer temperatures, we're having less rain. So all of this really started to change our forest up here. And this can be a similar story pretty much a lot of places in America. We're all going through climate change. We are all trying to figure out how to manage our forest. Well, when the forest started to look really different, when all those trees got chopped down, there was then that period of the trees regrowing. They were allowed to regrow, but they were all growing back at the same time, especially up here. A lot of our trees are pretty much the same age because they all grew back at the same time. So we don't have as much diversity as we would have if the forest had been through a natural burn cycle. So all of our trees, a lot of them are the same age. And then for a long time, a lot of them were the same species because there was no shade for the shade-loving trees to grow. So we have younger shade-loving trees and a little bit older sun-loving trees up here. Everything has gotten really out of whack. One thing I wanted to show you real quick, why Sugar Pine Point State Park is really cool, is because it's home to the world's largest pine cones. And this is a sugar pine cone. Now, the pine cone that holds the Guinness Book of World Records is about twice this long. So we do have sugar pine trees here now, as well as incense cedar trees, and they are big trees, but they have tiny cones. So we do have a more diverse forest these days, but still it is hurting still from the history that we've had. Now, when the trees started to grow back, there was that kind of that movement of only you can prevent forest fires, and forest fires are bad is basically the connotation that got spread. Now think in your head, do you think wildfires are good, wildfires are bad, or wildfires are somewhere in the middle? Well, really, it's all three. Some wildfires are really bad because they burn too hot and they burn up and kill everything in the forest. Now, some wildfires, fire in general is actually necessary for the cycle and health of the forest. So, fire can be both good and bad. There's a certain type of fire we do need, though, for our forest health. So, what three things, side question, do you think we need to create a fire? Maybe oxygen, fuel. In nature, fuel is at pine cones, pine needles, dead plants, and trees. And then we need heat, a spark. So in nature, that can be lightning, intense heat on a dry surface, somebody throwing their cigarette out the window, or maybe somebody having a campfire on a windy day when they're not supposed to, and a spark flies out of that and lights nature on fire. So oxygen, heat, and fuel are the three things we need to make a fire happen. And that is called the fire triangle. Here we go. Yes, so the fire triangle. Now, like I mentioned, we're going through some environmental climate change. So we're going through what is called a drought. So we're getting less rain and less snowpack. This year, for example, we are still below average in our snow, and it is March. So we're already actually scared, us local Tahoe folks, about what the summer might bring in terms of wildfire. Because when we don't have as much rain and as much snowpack, we have more plants die. When more plants die, they fall on the ground and equal more fuel on the ground. Because remember, dead plants, pine cones and pine needles are fuel. With warmer temperatures because of climate change, some plants will have a longer growing season. And when more plants grow, we have more fuels on the ground when they die. And we also, with those warmer temperatures, are having more infestations of insects because it's not getting cold enough in the winter to kill them out. So all of these plants dying equal more fuel on the ground, and more fuel on the ground increase our risk for mega fires. So did you know that the forest naturally burns every 10 to 40 years? That's without any interference from humans. So that's fires that just start naturally. And when we don't put them out, they can go through and, just like you can see here, kind of stay low to the ground and burn up the pine cones and pine needles. But when we stop those fires from happening, that fuel just stacks up on the ground. We have some places around here that haven't seen fire in 150 years. If you can imagine how much fuel, pine cones, pine needles, dead plants are on the ground after 150 years of time. Quite a lot. So I want to show you this really cool fire map. So in the last 20 years, we've actually had 18 of our biggest wildfires ever on record in California. Wow. 18 of our biggest wildfires ever in the last 20 years. Now, this map on the left is from 1878 to 1969. These are the wildfires that happened in the state. That's a span of 91 years that these are all the fires that we had. So you can see they're kind of little. They look, you can kind of see the different colors of green. So I think that's different fires. So you can see how they look as compared to this map over here. This is just 2020, just 1 year. Look at our fires. So what are some things you notice? Maybe the wildfire map for 2020 has much bigger fires. Imagine if that had been a 91-year span. What's the next 91 years going to look like if we don't do something to change how we care for our forest? You know, the whole state could be covered in this purple color. And these fires are big and they burn much hotter than these fires did. So, like we've said, when the Washoe were moved off their land, the trees were cut down, wildfires were not allowed to burn, and the climate started changing. our forests really started to look different. Now, I want to teach you how forest fires actually move through the forest. They're the different types of fire that we have. So you can see right here, this is called a surface fire. So the flames are staying really low to the ground. And this, because there's not a lot of fuel, it's staying much cooler temperature and the flames are staying smaller. Oops. Go back here. And so these surface fires are really good. That's the fire we need. So those flames are just basically coming through and vacuuming up the pine cones, pine needles, and returning those nutrients to the ground. Now, there are actually some pine cones here that grow on our pine trees that they only release their seeds when they see a low temperature flame. And so our forest here is used to fire. It actually needs fire to release its seeds. So surface fires are good fires. Now, this next type of fire, you'll see the flames are getting hotter. This is, and taller. So this means there's more fuel on the ground. Let's say this place hasn't burned in 50 plus years, maybe between 50 and 80 years. It might look kind of like this. So the flames are taller, it's burning hotter. The flames are starting to crawl up these medium-sized trees. That's called a ladder fire, when it climbs the trees like a ladder. And then you can see that the flames are starting to reach the bottom leaves of these big trees. Now that's really bad, because in this next picture, you can see when the fire climbs up here, it can jump to these big trees and then go all the way up to the crowns of the big trees, called a crown fire. So just like you wear a crown on your head, the fire is in the top of the trees, like a crown on the top of your head. And then once the fire is all the way up here, it can really easily jump from treetop to treetop, meaning it is eating so much fuel. It's burning super hot, killing everything, all just incinerating all those seeds that normally like fire, a low temperature fire. It's killing the little happy bacteria in the soil that helps things grow and helps things disintegrate and decompose. So we do not like those hot fires that you see on the far right. Those are also called mega fires. Now I want to show you what these different types of fires look like in motion. So a low intensity or a low temperature fire is good. You can see those flames are only a few inches tall, not a ton of smoke in the air. And our snowpack and rain really helps us keep the ground moist. You can see it's just coming through and kind of eating up the stuff on the forest floor. Not out of control looking, not super scary looking. Now, this is a high intensity wildfire. You can see this, it's already completely orange. The sky is orange itself. A lot more smoke here. The flames are actually starting to climb up the trunks of the trees. The ground is glowing orange with embers. The smoke is so thick, people are definitely getting evacuated out of this area. So that's what they kind of look like in person. Very different. Now, helicopter. Ooh, military plane. Very cool. Flying really low. Side note, I love aviation. Anyway, so I want to show you this picture. This is a picture from the Angora fire that happened in 2007, so 15 years ago. However, this photo was taken just a few months ago. So in 15 years of time, you can see nothing has really regrown besides some shrubs and some grasses. So it looks like maybe this one tree survived, but obviously he's not doing so great. But all of these trees are dead. And without the big adult trees to make baby trees, we're not going to have a forest regenerate. And that is because the flames that came through on this fire were super hot. It killed all of the adult trees. So how do you think trees protect themselves from fire? And I'm going to go over here and show you that tree. You can see my office in the background here. an old historical building. But I want to show you this big incense cedar tree we have here. You can see how far up the branches start. That's going to be like 60 feet up in the air at least. And I also wanted to show you how thick its bark is. So this tree is adapted to fire. So you can see down here how this is black. That's because a fire came up right here to the bark. You can even see it turns my fingers black. But the fire didn't eat into the bark very much. It just kind of went on its way. It's because it was a low temperature fire. You can also see, I can stick my finger in this tree, and my fingers are going in like that deep and still just hitting more bark. So the two adaptations that this tree has to fire is that its bark is really thick, almost kind of like a fireman's coat. It's kind of fireproof up to a certain temperature anyway. It does not do well in those high temperature fires. And the other adaptation is those tall, away from the ground branches. So that's called self-pruning. As this tree grows, it drops its lower branches so that they cannot catch on fire if a low temperature, small fire comes through. Those branches are safe. So you can look at my fire emoji back there. If that was a real flame, it's just going to come through, kind of turn the bottom of the tree a little bit black and move on its way. Now, since you know kind of how flames interact with a forest, let's think about this over here. So you can see these trees behind me. Let's say these are flames. How do you think these flames are going to interact with these trees? Maybe start to climb up those branches that are really low to the ground, climb up those trees and catch those trees on fire, create a ladder fire. Yeah, definitely possible. But as you can see, right from here, all the way over to our big incense cedar tree right here, there's not a bush in sight. It's very clean, and under this snow, if the snow was gone, you'd be able to see that it is just kind of a thin layer of pine needles. Now, that happened on purpose. The reason it is so clean in between is because of something called a prescribed burn. So just like the Native Americans used to care for the forest with fire, we as a land management agency, the state parks, and some other parks across America are really starting to understand that, oh, wow, we do need fire to keep our forests in a healthy cycle and not have too many fuels on the ground. So we burned this area on purpose. So I wanted to show you what that looks like. So prescribed burning is good fire. And just like a doctor writes a prescription, a fire doctor or fire scientist can write a prescription for a burn. So prescribed burning is a good fire. So you can see this fire scientist right here in fire clothing. They have a water hose right here, firefighter hose. They have all of this area right here stripped of fuel. So that's just gravel. And they have a little fire built right here. You can barely see the flames, and you can see that the smoke is going in one direction. So by the time you see The flames on a prescribed burn, that burn has been in the planning process for 2 whole years. So it is a multi-step process. Now, to show you a prescribed burn in action, they're coming through, they're hand thinning out the forest. They're going to pile all that stuff up. I'll show you that in a minute. Then they're lighting the forest on fire after they've gotten permission from the government to burn. They're also standing by with water hoses in case the fire is to go anywhere that we don't want it to. So they've thinned out the forest by hand. They pile that up in these big burn piles you see here. They've also come through, the fire scientists, and they have looked at every single tree in our forest. They mark them all, the land off in plots, and then they make sure to leave a certain ratio of old growth trees to new growth trees. They leave a diverse amount of species, and they also go ahead and cut down the trees that have diseases that they're going to die anyway, or they have maybe some infestations of bugs that are going to spread to other trees. And they go ahead and thin out the forest so there's less fuels, because our forest is actually kind of overgrown a lot because we weren't allowing wildfires to burn for so long. So our forest is really thick, not just the stuff on the ground, but also the trees that are standing. So by the time you see these piles burn, they have been drying out for a year. Now, a lot of stuff has to line up for us to have these prescribed burns. There can't be a lot of pollution in the air because even though smoke is a natural thing, it's still a particle in the air. So there has to be a low particle count in the air. The government has to say it's okay. They will have come through and marked the trees that they want and already have cut those down. And thin the forest by hand. Now, let's say a mama and a baby bear walk in. And this happened to us last season. The day of, this burn has been in the planning process for 2 years. Today is the day it's going to burn. And a mama and a baby bear walk in. Now, they canceled the burn. Even though that mama and baby bear might have just been napping for a few hours and moving on out, they didn't want to cause a stress like that on a mama and a baby bear. So the fire scientists are very conscientious of the wildlife in the area. Now, a question I get asked a lot is, well, if they burn a lot of land, where do the wildlife go? And that's a good question. We here at the California State Parks don't burn a ton of land at the same time. We might just burn an area that is just a few acres, and it's that very slow moving, low temperature fire. So animals have a sense of when wildfire is coming, and they can sense that and get out of the way before the flames come through. Another question I get is, well, what happens to all of the food that you're burning up? Where does the wildlife find food? So I want to show you a time lapse of a prescribed burn and how it regrows in the 2 months following a prescribed burn. So this prescribed burn in particular was in Georgia. I borrowed their video from YouTube, but you can see how the forest responded over the next 2 months of time. All right, our time lapse has started. You can start to see some smoke. You can see the flames just moving in, kind of like a vacuum cleaner, just kind of running through real quick. It's not climbing the trees. It's not killing the trees. Now, you're already starting to see some green. That might have been like a week and a half later or so. And there's just more green and more green happening, and you can't even tell the bark of the trees isn't even really black. So that is an example of a prescribed burn and how the forest regenerates afterwards. Very cool. All right, let's see what's on our next slide here. So how can you help? How can you help prevent wildfires from burning up maybe where you live? So you can do a thing called house hardening, which is make sure the pine needles are out of the gutter and roof of like the corners of the roof of your house, because of course that's fuel. You'll want to rake the pine needles away from your house. Space out any plants in your yard so they're not touching each other. Mow grass to a height of 4 inches. And then, of course, move flammable things away from your home. So anything with gasoline, like a lawnmower, you would want to set further away from your house. So if it does start to burn up, it won't catch your house on fire. Now, how can you help limit environmental climate change? Well, you can use less energy and water. So turn off the lights when you leave a room. Don't let the water run the whole time you brush your teeth. You can plant trees in an area that needs trees. So like that place I showed you where the wildfire came through, that could be a very good candidate for tree plantings. You can drive electric cars and take public transportation and walk. That helps limit the pollutants in the air, helps keep our ozone more intact. You can also eat more vegetables because they have less of an environmental impact than beef and dairy do. Throw less food away. So when you throw food away, you're wasting all of the resources it took to make that food. And food also in the landfill releases methane gas. So it is better to compost food if you do have to throw it away. And then, of course, reduce the things you use. Reuse things instead of throwing them away, like your quote single-use plastic silverware. It doesn't have to be single-use, just wash it. And there's repair. So repair things you have instead of throwing it away and buying new one. And then, of course, recycling. So there are lots of ways that you can get involved. If you are a youth of color, you can join groups like the Latino Heritage Internship Program or Mosaics in Science, and they can help you get involved with the outdoors. If you want to grow up to be a fire doctor, fire scientist, you can work for the California Conservation Corps, and those are the folks that come through and chop the trees down and light the forest on fire with the prescribed burns. Now, you can also, of course, work for the California State Parks Foundation or California State Parks like I do, and I am an interpretive park employee, so I help lead all the educational things. So you can be an interpreter like me, but you could also be maybe a police officer for the parks. You could work in maintenance and help keep our beautiful buildings looking good. You can also work in the museum side of parks, so helping taking care of our artifacts. And then there's environmental scientists and archaeologists, all sorts of really cool jobs within parks. But I hope that you've learned a lot today about fire and why we actually need certain types of fire to keep our forest in a good cycle, in a healthy cycle with its fuel load, and help return those nutrients that are on the ground back into the ground with those low temperature flames. Prescribed burning is kind of a new idea. We can do it on our state park property, but there's a lot of like private homes that and private land that of course we can't do anything about. So if you could help us spread the word about prescribed burning and how people can do it on their own land if they want to, and there's a lot of resources out there to help them do that. All right, well, I am going to stop recording this session and jump into the chat and answer any questions that are in there. But thank you, people, for joining me today, and come and visit us in the parks.